Welcome to ZEA Talks COVID series. It's a pleasure to have with us today Dr. Orestis Troumpounis, Assistant Professor of Economics at the Department of Economics. His research is interdisciplinary at the intersection of economics and political science. Thanks for joining us today, Orestis. Today, we're here to share some thoughts on the effects of the COVID-19 epidemic and its economic consequences on politics. Orestis, could you please start by giving us some insights on the short-run effects of COVID-19?
Yeah, of course. Thanks a lot for having me here. The short-run effects actually look pretty good for political leaders all around the world. So, starting and thinking locally, if we think of Italy, the government has been gaining support and President Conte is gaining an unprecedented popularity. So if we go back in time, in January, his approval ratings were around 50%. Then in February, his approval ratings around 53%. But in March already we are around 61%. And by April, this number is close to 66%. So basically what we say is that local governments, and particularly political leaders, in the short run are benefiting significantly. And this is not only the case about Italy, this is a global phenomenon, or mostly global. So if we look around the world leaders manage to gain some short-run success of the way they manage the crisis. So if you see on this graph, basically the vertical line on the 11th of March is when the WHO declares the pandemic of COVID. And as you can see afterwards, like for a week after or 10 days, all leaders, and depending on exactly when they implemented their lockdown strategies, are gaining a lot in popularity. And this is even happening for very unpopular leaders at the time. So Emmanuel Macron was facing trouble inside France. After he declares these lockdown measures, he immediately gains in support. And this is also true for Boris Johnson, with a famous situation where he ended up also hospitalized. Angela Merkel had to go out and make herself declarations on the importance of the pandemic, also short-run increase in her popularity and her government, while previously internal politics were not looking great. So this is a global phenomenon, and actually, this in political science has a name. It is the so-called rally around the flag effect. So this is a concept that is well documented. Basically, in times of war or of an international crisis, political leaders and their governments enjoy, at least in the short run, significant increase in their support. So a prominent example, if we go back a few years ago, is the September 11 attacks. So George Bush at the time had approval ratings around 50%. Within a week following the attacks, his approval ratings went up to 90%. So now leaders are aware of this phenomenon, okay? And it is not, coincidence that most European leaders declared their lockdown measures using a very similar language. So basically this language was speaking to the emotion of voters, and what it wanted to achieve is exactly this. So announcement of lockdown rules as a war declaration, we were all fighting against an invisible enemy at the time, was repeated and was the common way to announce these measures, potentially at the back of the mind of politicians, keeping the short-run effect and support for their government tough, indeed, policies.
Thanks for these considerations. Is there any evidence on whether the support for stringency policy varies across groups of citizens?
Yes, indeed. So not all individuals or citizens appreciate equally the stringency measures and these lockdown measures taken by governments. So if we go and see individual data, I could show you some evidence that I have available from France, and I would assume that similar situation happens in most of European countries. Age is a clear factor increasing the probability of people complying to lockdown measures. So the older people are, the more likely it is that they comply with such measures. Female individuals also tend to comply more. This effect is also important in urban areas, or individuals who are known to be self-conscient or declare themselves to be self-conscient. Now, the effect instead is lower, is negative, and actually less likely to comply with such measures are people who vote and support parties from the far left or from the far right. And this is important because it already gives us some feeling that also partisanship and beliefs of voters on which leaders are the right for the country are important. And if this was the case in France, I will now take you to a further example, which is even more important than this is the US. So in the US, there has been a very different speech coming from Democrats and Republicans. So partisanship is important because it helps voters who are not informed about all possible issues, and COVID being one of those. Partisanships help voters decide about certain issues when we lack some information. So unlike many countries, think of Europe, for example, where the language among political leaders was similar, in the US, there is much more polarization, and the US leaders were sending conflicting messages about the crisis. So Trump and other Republican officials were clearly saying that this COVID crisis is less severe than we think, while Democrats on the other side were giving more emphasis to its dangers. And these differences were actually echoed by partisan media, which are also important in the US context. So this could cause differences between how people on the right or on the left adjust to such measures of social distancing proposed by parties. And this could have potentially important effects on health outcomes and the economy. So let me show you on this graph how Democrat counties, so counties where they're basically voting Democrats versus countries that they're voting Republicans, increase their social distancing once there is a state order to do so. So basically, in Democrat counties, we see that there is an increase in social distancing by over 5 percentage points, more than in counties without such state order. And in contrast, Republican counties respond much less. So Republican counties just increase their social distancing by about 2 percentage points, while basically this effect, as you can see on this graph, after a week or 9 days, it is very close to zero. So indeed, partisanship and political beliefs are important in whether there is support or not for social distancing and lockdown measures. And coming to Italy, a nice example is what occurs across different regions, varying in social capital. So Italy is a known example of a country where basically there is large heterogeneity of social capital. I will not be entering into details, but if you see the map of Italy on the left and you see these different colors, basically I'm illustrating different levels of social capital in different parts of the country. Now, the social capital in a given community, in a given society, is known since work back from the 90s to affect the contribution to public goods and solving basically collective action problems. And places where societies, where the social capital is higher, are well known to be good at solving the collective action problem and providing public goods efficiently. And now the crisis we are facing and adhering to social distancing orders and lockdown rules is a clear example of contributing to the provision of a public good. So individuals have to pay an individual cost of staying at home and adhering to these measures so that we are contributing to these public goods, which is contagion avoidance. And now any individual managing to limit contagion contributes clearly to a decrease in the probability of the virus circulating around and other members of the society getting it. Therefore, basically an example of generating positive externalities. So if you see on the graph on the right, and the split of regions, think of the blue line as the places in the country with highest civic social capital. the red line mid-social capital and the green line less social capital, what we see is that high social capital regions, places, by the 21st of February, are very good in reducing their mobility. So you see, after the 21st of February, when the strict lockdown measures were not still in place, but people start just becoming aware of this virus being around us, and we see immediately a drop in mobility. And this drop is much more pronounced in high and mid social capital places. Now, once we go on the 9th of March, where the lockdown measures are in place, actually the high social capital places in Italy, mobility observed is even lower than in low social capital places. So basically, we see that depending on social capital levels across the country, people respond more or less to such advice to stay at home. Now, let me highlight that this is not a north-south divide in Italy. This is not the case. Even if one was to split, to focus the discussion only on the north of the country, the discussion I just described you goes through. And this is particularly important if one thinks of the future, right? So if you can see on the graph, lockdown measures are very effective in general in reducing mobility. But as we move to the future, it is not very likely that we will be very often with such strict lockdown rules as we faced the last period. Instead, we will still be advised significantly to adhere to these norms of social distancing, and thinking of social capital as a potential factor is, I think, important as politicians take further measures and thinking ahead.
Thanks. So as we move forward, what are the facts one should be looking at?
Well, predicting anything about the future is very difficult, so I would rather skip that, particularly thinking of government formation in Italy and so on. So just forget about it. Don't expect me anything in that direction. But I would be after particularly two facts that as a political economist I'm interested in. So first of all, I would be interested to see how populist movements are going to be gaining or not support as we move forward. You know, in the first part of my talk, I described you how established parties basically managed to get a short-run boost in their popularity. But as we move forward, we are all expecting significant effects on the economy, a severe economic crisis coming in. And actually these issues are the ones that brought populist movement a lot of support in previous years. So as we move forward, I think it is going to be very important to focus attention on populist movements, and then whether they will manage to get support or not, and how basically established parties are going to be competing with those. A second fact that I'm interested in focusing is basically voters' capacity to update their views or their beliefs, if you want, about political leaders, about their political leaders and the government. So we know that when there is a correlated shock hitting different regions, if I want to think in an Italian context, or hitting different countries, if I want to think of it as a European context, well, this correlated shock gives information to voters on the performance of their politicians. And basically, voters have some ideas and some ways to update their beliefs and decide whether they want to re-elect their current governors or prime ministers, or whether they want just to give the chance to someone else. So this is well known to happen in the literature and documented, and I think it is interesting to be in search of this idea in the COVID situation and as we move forward.
Okay, thanks a lot for sharing your thoughts with us, and thanks for your time.
Thank you very much for having me, and it was my pleasure. Thanks.